The morning after my mother-in-law's funeral, I found my brother-in-law sitting at my kitchen table, not standing in the doorway, not waiting on the porch, sitting at my kitchen table in my chair with a mug of my coffee like he owned the place, which, as it turned out, he believed he did. I still had dirt on my shoes from the cemetery. I hadn't even taken off my coat. His name is Conrad. He's 53 years old, and he has never, in the 26 years I've known him, made his own bed. I say that not to be cruel. I say it because it's the kind of detail that matters when you're trying to understand how a person becomes the kind of man who sits in a dead woman's kitchen the day she's buried and tells her daughter-in-law to get out. There was a woman with him I didn't recognize at first. She was sitting across from Conrad, a leather folder open on the table in front of her, papers fanned out like she was about to close on a house. And I suppose, in a way, she was. My husband Walter was standing by the window. He wouldn't look at me. That's when I knew. You spend 31 years with a man. You learn his tells. Walter's is the window. He stares out it when he doesn't want to be somewhere, when he's ashamed, when he's already made a decision and doesn't want to defend it. He was staring at the neighbor's oak tree like it owed him money. "Sit down, Judith," Conrad said. He said my name the way he always has, with a slight pause before it, like he has to remind himself what it is. I didn't sit down. I set my purse on the counter and I said, "Who is this?" The woman introduced herself, a paralegal from a firm in Dayton. She slid a document across the table before I'd even pulled out a chair. "This is Dorothy's will," Conrad said, "executed 6 weeks ago. Dorothy was my mother-in-law. She was 81 years old, and for the last 9 years she had lived in the back bedroom of this house, the one we converted when her hip got bad the second time, and we both agreed, Walter and I, that a nursing home wasn't something we were willing to do to her. We agreed on that. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't my idea forced on him. We sat at the same table and we agreed. What I didn't know until I was standing in my coat with cemetery dirt on my shoes was that Walter had apparently stopped agreeing somewhere along the way and just hadn't told me. The will was 2 pages. Conrad got the house. Conrad got the savings account. $340,000, which I had not known existed, though I had written the check for Dorothy's prescriptions every month for 9 years. I was listed at the bottom, a paragraph that described me as a dedicated caregiver and left me $6,000 in gratitude for services rendered. Services rendered. I read that line 3 times. There's also the matter of the timeline, Conrad said. He had his hands folded on the table the way men do when they think they're being reasonable. We're not trying to be unkind. You have 30 days. 30 days. I looked at Walter. He was still looking at the oak tree. I put the will back on the table. I picked up my purse. And I walked out of the kitchen, down the hall, and into the bedroom Dorothy had slept in for 9 years. I sat on the edge of her bed. The room still smelled like her. Lavender and the particular warmth of old wood furniture. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. I hadn't moved anything yet. I hadn't been able to. I sat there for a long time. Let me tell you about Dorothy, because she deserves that. She deserves more than a footnote in whatever story Conrad is going to tell about this. When I married Walter in 1993, Dorothy shook my hand at the reception and said, "I've heard a lot about you. Most of it was good." Then she smiled, and I understood immediately that this was her sense of humor and that we were going to get along fine. She was not a soft woman. She had raised 2 boys alone after her husband died of a heart attack at 44, worked the front desk at a dental office for 20 years, driven herself to every single one of Conrad's baseball games and Walter's debate tournaments, and never once complained about it, at least not to me. She had opinions about everything, the correct way to fold a fitted sheet, the inferiority of gas stoves, what time dinner should be served, and she delivered them without apology and without cruelty, which I found, honestly, refreshing. We were not alike. I grew up in a family where disagreement was the kind of weather you waited out. Dorothy treated disagreement like a conversation. It took me a few years to stop flinching when she said, "I don't think that's right," and understand that she wasn't angry. She was just talking. By the time her hip went the first time, when she was 72, we had settled into something I would call friendship without ever having called it that out loud. When the hip went the second time, and the doctor used the phrase cognitive changes for the first time in a way that made Walter go quiet in the car on the way home, I was the one who said we should bring her to live with us. I meant it. I had watched my own grandmother go through a memory care facility, and I had stood in those hallways and felt the particular helplessness of visiting someone who doesn't know you've come. I didn't want that for Dorothy. I didn't want it for Walter either. He was still her son. He should have been able to walk down the hall and say goodnight to his mother without buying a plane ticket. So we converted the back bedroom. We widened the door frame. We installed grab bars and a walk-in shower and a hospital bed with a remote. I learned how to manage a pill organizer across 7 medications. I learned what a bad night looked like and what a good night looked like, and the difference between the two at 3 in the morning. Conrad visited at Christmas, and for 4 days in July, he brought wine. By the 5th year, Dorothy would sometimes forget my name for a few days at a time. She'd call me the woman, or sometimes dear, and there were stretches where I wasn't sure she knew I was her daughter-in-law, or just a person who came into a room to bring her meals. But there were other days when she was sharp and present and funny, and on those days she'd grab my hand when I brought her afternoon tea and say things like, "You're a good woman, Judith. I've always known that." I held on to those days. By the 7th year, I had stopped working. I had been a bookkeeper, part-time for a small accounting firm. I liked it. I was good at it. But Dorothy's needs had grown past what I could manage between 9 and 2, and we agreed, Walter and I, again at this table, that it made more financial sense for me to stop working than to hire a full-time caregiver. Walter was still working then. We had savings. It made sense on paper. What didn't make sense, in retrospect, was that I had not considered what it would mean for me to be 63 years old with a 9-year gap in my employment history and $6,000 to my name. I wasn't thinking about that then. I was thinking about Dorothy. She passed on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly in her sleep. I was the one who found her. Walter was already at work. I had gone in to bring her breakfast, oatmeal with brown sugar, which she'd requested the night before with a sudden clarity that, looking back, I recognize now as something that sometimes happens near the end. And she was gone. I sat with her for a while before I called anyone. I know that sounds strange, but she looked peaceful in a way she hadn't in a long time, and I wasn't ready to hand that over to the machinery of death certificates and funeral directors and phone calls just yet. I sat in the chair by her bed and held her hand and said goodbye properly. She deserved that. Walter cried at the funeral. Conrad wore a navy suit and shook hands with people he didn't know and said she went peacefully 5 or 6 times in a row. I stood at the graveside in my good black coat and helped the funeral director with the lowering because no one else seemed to know what to do, and someone had to do it. I rode to the cemetery with Walter. I assumed I would ride home with Walter. Instead, he said he was going to ride with Conrad. To talk, he said. He didn't say what about. I drove home alone. When I walked into my kitchen and found Conrad at my table, some part of me understood, before I read a single word of that document, that the conversation in Conrad's car had not been about grief. I slept in Dorothy's room that night. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because it was the only room in the house that felt honest. I went through her things slowly over the next 3 days. Walter barely spoke to me. He slept in our bedroom, and I slept in the back room, and we passed each other in the kitchen like tenants in a house where no one has agreed to the lease anymore. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just being with her, I suppose, in the last way I could. Her closet was organized the way she'd always kept it. Blouses on one side, slacks on the other, shoes lined up on the floor in pairs. She had kept shoe boxes on the top shelf going back decades. I found her granddaughter's baby shoes in one, a corsage from what must have been a high school dance in another, brittle and brown but still holding its shape. I went through them one by one. The last box was heavier than the others. Inside, there was a legal-sized envelope. My name was on the outside in Dorothy's handwriting, the handwriting from before the tremors got bad, so it had been written a while ago. Underneath my name she had written, "Open when you're ready," not before. I sat down on the floor of her closet. I wasn't ready, but I opened it. There were 3 things inside. The first was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages. I'm not going to put every word of it here because some of it belongs to me and I'm keeping it, but I'll tell you what mattered. Dorothy wrote that she had known for the last 2 years what Conrad had been planning. She wrote that Walter had told her about Conrad's conversations, the ones about the house, about her accounts, about what should happen after, and that she had listened and said nothing, and let Conrad believe she was agreeable because she had learned, over the course of her life, that men like Conrad are best handled by silence and misdirection. She wrote that she was sorry she hadn't told me. She wrote that she had wanted to many times, but that she had been afraid of what it would do to my marriage, to my life inside that house, if I knew what Walter had agreed to. She wrote, "I should have trusted you with the truth sooner. You are stronger than either of us gave you credit for." The second thing in the envelope was a business card, an attorney named Patricia Osei in Columbus. On the back of the card, in Dorothy's handwriting, she has the real one. "She's been waiting for your call." The third thing was a key on a small ring with a paper tag that said, "Safe Deposit, First Federal, Millbrook Branch." And under that, Box 447, "Your name is on the account." It has been since 2019. I called Patricia Osei the next morning. She was brisk and warm at the same time, which I appreciated. She said Dorothy had come to her office in the spring of 2021, accompanied by her doctor, who had provided written confirmation that Dorothy was of sound mind and fully competent to make legal decisions. Patricia had drafted the will that day. Dorothy had signed it, had it witnessed and notarized, and Patricia had kept the original in her firm's safe. She had been expecting my call. The will Conrad presented, Patricia said, is not a legal document. It was not prepared by an attorney. It was not signed by your mother-in-law in the presence of a notary. She paused to let me absorb that. What Dorothy actually left is considerably different from what was presented to you at that table. I drove to the bank in Millbrook on a Thursday morning by myself. The branch manager pulled up the account, confirmed my name on it, and took me back to the safe deposit area without any drama. Box 447 was not large. It contained a cashier's check dated 3 weeks before Dorothy died, made out in my name in the amount of $280,000. There was a note attached in Dorothy's handwriting. "This was always yours. Every year you gave me, I was keeping count." There was also a deed. The house we lived in, the one Conrad was planning to move into, was not in Walter's name. It had never been in Walter's name. Dorothy had purchased it in 1987, and it was in a trust. As of the document in that box, the trust had been amended. The house went to me, not to Walter, not to Conrad, to me. I sat in the bank parking lot for about 20 minutes. Then I called Patricia Osei and told her what I'd found. "Good," she said. "I've already filed the real will with the probate court, Conrad's attorney, and I use that term loosely. That document was prepared by a paralegal with no supervising attorney signature, has been notified. I expect you'll be receiving some phone calls." She was right about that. Conrad called twice that evening. Walter called once and left a voicemail that I didn't listen to for 2 days. When I finally played it, he was crying. He said he hadn't known about the safe deposit box. He said Conrad had told him the will was legitimate. He said he was sorry. I believe some of it. I still believe some of it. I've had time to think about it, and I think Walter is not a cruel man. He's a weak one, which in some ways is worse, because it's harder to hate and easier to be surprised by. He knew what Conrad was planning. He let it happen. He stood at that window and he let me walk into that room alone, and he let me read that document and he said nothing. That's not ignorance. That's a choice. I moved out 2 weeks later. Not because Conrad's will held up. It didn't. It was rejected by the probate court inside of 6 weeks. But because I needed to make a decision about my life that was mine to make, not one that was handed to me by a legal proceeding. I rented a small house on the other side of town. 2 bedrooms, a gas stove. Dorothy would have approved, and a yard with a maple tree that had been there long enough to have opinions. I hired Patricia Osei to handle the divorce. She turned out to be, among other things, extremely good at that. I am 64 years old. I spent 9 years caring for a woman who ended up being the person who took care of me. Just in a way neither of us talked about out loud. I have a house that belongs to me, and money that is mine, and a divorce that will be final in the spring. Conrad contested the will in probate. His attorney, the real kind, he found an actual one eventually, argued incompetence, argued undue influence, argued timing. Patricia argued back with Dorothy's doctor's written competency evaluation, with the notarized signature, with the 2019 bank documents, with the paper trail Dorothy had been quietly building for 2 years, while Conrad was visiting 4 days in July and bringing wine. The court sided with the real will. I heard Conrad told people afterward that Dorothy had been manipulated, that I had somehow engineered this, that I had gotten to an old woman in her decline and convinced her to leave me everything. What I know is this: Dorothy Marsh was sharper at 81 on her worst day than her son gave her credit for on any day. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who assumed her quietness was weakness, and she had spent 2 years in the back bedroom of my house being very, very quiet. She left a note in the last album I found in her closet, tucked behind a photograph of herself at maybe 35, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize, laughing at something outside the frame. The note said, "The people who assume you have no plan are always the most surprised when they find out you've had one all along." I put that note in a frame. It's on the wall in my kitchen now, in my house, above the gas stove. I think about her every morning when I make coffee. I think she knew. She always knew. And she decided that I was worth the plan. I've thought a lot about what Dorothy was actually doing during those last 2 years. Not the illness, not the medications, not the slow narrowing of her world down to one room and one window and the same lavender smell every morning. I mean, what she was doing underneath all of that. The phone calls she made when I was out, the appointments I didn't know about, the quiet, steady work of a woman who had decided that the people who underestimated her were going to be very surprised. She didn't talk about it. That's the part that stays with me. She let Conrad visit in July and bring his wine and sit at the table and speak about her future as though she weren't in the next room. She let Walter go along with it. She let them build their whole plan on the assumption that she was too far gone to notice, too diminished to act, too dependent to have a preference. And she said nothing. She just kept being Dorothy, kept asking for oatmeal with brown sugar, kept grabbing my hand when I brought her tea, kept making small dry jokes about the weather, and in between all of that, she was building something they would never see coming. I think about the kind of intelligence that requires, not cleverness, not strategy in the way people mean when they talk about winning, something quieter than that. The ability to watch people clearly without bitterness and understand exactly what they are. Dorothy understood what Conrad was. She understood what Walter was. She understood that confronting them would only give them time to adjust. So she didn't confront them. She just made sure that the truth had somewhere solid to land when the time came. That's what she left me. Not just the house. Not just the money, though those things saved my life in a very practical sense, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She left me a lesson about the difference between reacting and deciding. Conrad reacted to everything, to grief, to money, to the idea that he was owed something just for existing in proximity to a woman who had worked hard her whole life. His whole plan was a reaction. And it fell apart the way reactions usually do, loudly and badly, and in a probate court in front of a judge who had very little patience for a document without a notary seal. Dorothy decided. She decided 2 years before any of this happened. She decided when she was sick and tired and losing ground, and she made her decision with a clear head and a good attorney and a safe deposit box that nobody knew about except her and me. I'm 64 years old. I spent 9 years in a house where I gave everything I had and almost lost everything I was, and what I know now, standing in my own kitchen on the other side of all of it, is that the women who survive are not always the loudest ones. They're not always the ones who fight in the room. Sometimes they're the ones who already filed the paperwork. I want to be more like Dorothy. I'm working on it.